Our group's topic is ecological violence, and in honor of June being National Dairy Month, we are presenting on the violence and mass trauma perpetrated by the dairy industry on cows and the environment. The $620 billion US dairy industry is part of the system of animal agriculture that acts as the single most destructive contributor to the climate crisis we are currently facing. The negative environmental impacts caused by raising dairy cows on an industrial level are extreme and far-reaching. Greenhouse gas emissions from dairy and beef cows and their byproducts make up 51% of global emissions. That's more than the entire combined global transportation sector. These gases include methane and nitrous oxide, which are vastly more damaging than carbon dioxide alone. One professor of earth science at Duke says that methane is the best lever we have to reduce the growth in climate-driven fires, hurricanes, and heat waves over the next 30 years. While methane stays in the atmosphere for a shorter amount of time than carbon dioxide, unlike nitrous oxide, which stays for an average of 114 years, the warming effect of methane is much more intense in the short term. If dairy and beef cows produce the majority of the world's emissions, that means reducing our consumption of meat and dairy products has a direct positive impact on global warming. Exorbitant water use is another huge impact of the dairy industry on the environment. It takes hundreds of gallons of water to provide for the food and water needs of a single cow. And as a result, the meat and dairy industry account for 30% of the world's water consumption. The animals produce huge amounts of waste, which then overwhelm and pollute waterways, destroying aquatic habitats and populations of fish and other aquatic species. Finally, the dairy industry, as part of animal agriculture as a whole, is the most potent driver of global deforestation, even causing 91% of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. This deforestation, in turn, causes mass destruction of forest-dwelling animals and insects as they lose their habitats to animal agriculture. The land gained in the deforestation process is used to graze cows for meat and dairy production, and also to grow the grain needed to sustain them on a mass scale. Like all forms of violence, the impacts of dairy-driven trauma do not occur within a vacuum, but have widespread rippling effects on our global ecosystem. And that is saying nothing of the physical, emotional, and spiritual devastation perpetrated on the cows themselves, even at farms that are sincerely concerned with animal welfare. While the dairy industry has marketed its products as the wholesome contributions of happy cows grazing freely on sunny green pastures, the reality of most dairy farming is starkly different. Like any other mammal, cows can only produce milk when pregnant or having recently given birth. This means that they are artificially inseminated by force. Then when they give birth after 9 months of pregnancy, often a traumatic experience on its own, no matter your species, their calves are taken away within a few days' time, if not immediately. There are stories of cows wailing so mournfully after their babies were taken that local police were called to investigate the sound, only to have the experience dismissed as normal. In reference to one such call, a responding officer said that it happens every year at the same time. Adult females often have their horns sawed off or burned off, and female calves have their horn buds destroyed when they are merely weeks old. Male calves are sold into the beef industry as well as veal, and female calves stay to become dairy cows themselves. Tails are cut off with loppers, and as with horn removal procedures, this is often done without any sort of anesthetic to numb the pain, and is also done more as a convenience to the farmer rather than for any sort of necessary practical purpose. Milk is extracted using vacuum machines, and then the entire process of forced impregnation, pregnancy, giving birth, separation, and milk extraction is repeated every year for 2 to 5 years until milk production wanes. Then the cows are sold into the beef industry to be slaughtered for meat, despite having a natural lifespan of 18 to 22 years. While interest in cow milk is waning on a consumer level, the dairy industry still contributes about 1% of the US's GDP, making it a powerful political interest in our government with formidable resources at its disposal. Because we still, as a culture, see ourselves as the center of the ecological universe, we feel entitled to take what we want from other living creatures like cows, no matter the widespread consequences for them, for the planet, and ultimately for the future of our own species. We have to ask ourselves if fulfilling personal diet desires and cravings whenever and as often as we want is worth the true cost of dairy and meat production.
Hi, everyone. I have the analysis of animal agriculture with a focus of impacts on the meat and dairy industry. Okay, some influences that I don't think a lot of people talk about are governmental influences, profits and subsidized costs from mass industrial farming, the concept of growing population, and manipulation of public information, censorship, and lobbyist groups in policymaking that inevitably form laws. Okay, so the idea of our group is our government is controlling what we eat. Lobbyist groups such as animal agricultural alliances are manipulating public opinions by uses of false information to perpetrate their narrative. So their motto currently on their website is connect, engage, and protect, which is a little misleading when you go to think about it, especially the word protect. And the idea of free range or cage free chicken is also a lie. It's basically, how do we define it as law? So, in accordance with the US Department of Agriculture guidelines, free range chickens are allowed access to an outdoor area. However, official governments read producers must demonstrate to the agency that the poultry has been allowed access to the outside. Well, what does that mean? In reality, these birds are confined to warehouses where they technically have accesses to outdoors that lead to a designated outdoor area. But because of the mass crowding of birds, it's highly unlikely that many of them will ever actually see daylight during their extremely short lives. And I included a picture over here of what these chickens actually look like when they're mass incarcerated like this. They end up developing high anxiety and diseases that causes them to lose their feathers. And that's something to think about. That's actually what you're eating. So I also some images of factory farming with broiler chickens or free range chickens. So you can see over here on the left, the dairy industry, the egg production. And then this, because they're not in cages, this is considered cage-free chickens. And then here's some more images of the dairy and meat industry that are very misleading. To the left, this is actually a close-up of chickens that are used to produce eggs at a mass rate. The second photo to the left in the center is of cows producing milk at an extreme rate. So what they do is they constantly take a needle and inject the cow because the only way she can produce milk is to be pregnant. And in order to elongate the producing of milk, they actually keep their baby calves outside crying, which is something we mentioned in the background. And then I also included some pictures of how they encage pigs as well. It's kind of gross to think about. Most of the chickens you actually consume for meat are still babies. They're only 42 days old, and that is basically their whole entire lives, is to be bred, to be eaten, to only have lived for less than 2 months. So why does this matter? How is this affecting the environment, what we do to these chickens, what we do to these cows? How does that really contribute to ecological violence and mass destruction of the planet? Great question. So let's talk about the environment. Meat and dairy farming take up about 50% of habitable land for mass farming to sustain the massive amount of food and supply the Earth's population: dairy cows, factory pigs, broiler chickens, and so on. So what do I mean when we take out 50% of the land? Okay, well, this is a great photo to kind of show how our land is kind of broken down and how agriculture it plays a big part of that. So the land that we do have compared to our oceans, the ones that are habitable, are 50% is used to feed and raise animals. So some cool things I think this chart also shows is the global calorie supply and the global protein supply. So you can see that majority of our protein doesn't come from animals, but majority of our land is used to constantly grow more animals and feed our growing population. We're actually using more land to feed the animals we eat than the actual animals, which is kind of crazy to think about. So a good quote here is that we actually use about 77% of global farming lands to produce 18% of the world's calories and 37 of the total protein. So there's actually some other there's some other ripple effects that actually happen from factory farming. It actually occurs in our ocean, which is actually the #1 polluter in our ocean. So it's not plastic bags, it's none of those things. Those are good initiatives to have, but actually animal waste is one of the major leading causes of pollution in our oceans. So animal waste can include residues, heavy metals, harmful bacteria, which can leak into our water supply. So animal waste actually has designated ponds and designated lagoons. However, these will end up, and there's a good case for this that's actually happened a few years ago in North Carolina, where actually it spills into our ocean, which is changing the acidic levels in our ocean, which is kind of gross to think about. So let's talk about the science behind waste in our ocean and how that is contributing to climate change. So when there is an increase or decrease in the ocean's temperature, so when it doesn't remain at a homeostasis, it actually starts to begin to destroy coral reefs that need the water to only fluctuate to a normalcy that it can handle. And if it doesn't, then what ends up happening is these coral reefs will actually become white, and it's called coral bleaching, and they will die. And so they no longer produce nutrients that a lot of animals feed off of. So this is actually destroying ecodiversity. It's destroying food sources and ecosystems that rely on coral reefs in the environment, in the ocean environment. Okay, so a man-made issue that is also severely affecting the ocean is the rise in acidic levels. Oceans have absorbed almost 1/3 of all carbon dioxide emissions related to human activity. So here's a graph that kind of breaks down ocean acidification. This kind of shows you what's actually happening in the ocean and how that actually is happening to marine life that can't survive at these temperatures.
So first, I want to start by saying that in order to heal from anything, we have to acknowledge its existence in our life. We need to recognize what the driving force is. And time and time again throughout this class, we've seen the power that comes from ignoring a situation. The US has ignored Rwanda and did nothing to help in Cambodia. When the people who hold positions of power in our government are questioned, they too plead ignorance. The theme I see occurring is ignoring. We neglect people that have needed help, and we are ignoring the slow takedown of our own society. At a certain point, it becomes impossible to ignore what's happening to our resources. We as a society continue to overfish and destroy land with farming and agriculture. However, I think that this takedown of our resources can be helped. It sounds very intimidating, but it is possible. I think we can emerge from this trend of violence on our own ecosystem by becoming better educated. Figuring out what you as an individual can do to help is a step in the right direction. Questioning the ethical side of dairy and meat that we consume is how change can begin. The documentaries on Netflix, such as Seaspiracy and Cowspiracy, are both great documentaries to watch and start becoming more informed on how we're really getting these animal products. Before this class, I honestly had no idea how we even got milk. I also had no idea how much land was destroyed from the cows. While watching these documentaries, it became clear that this issue is not really being talked about. There's a very large hesitation to talk about ecological devastation that comes from farming because farming does produce so much money for our society. This money that goes into the people of power, obviously they want to keep generating that income. Of course, it makes sense to them, but what good is this money really going to do us if we have no land left and no animals left? This is the reality if we continue to ignore the effects of even just the dairy industry alone. I think that these documentaries are giving a voice to animals that are clearly being mistreated, as well as bringing awareness to the trauma that we're inflicting on our land, water, and atmosphere. So after finding out how devastating the dairy and meat industry is, I wanted to figure out what we as a society can do alongside of just educating ourselves. A really great option would be changing our diets. We're fed this idea that we need meat to survive and be healthy and strong. And this is from a very early age. We're repeated this information with not a whole lot of science to back it up, as well as little to no information on how we're actually getting this dairy. I think that if humans were educated early on and would flip the roles and think of how barbaric it would be to endure the same treatment as female cows, I think we'd be less inclined to give milk to our children. This goes back to what's also been discussed throughout this course, just humans thinking that we have the ultimate power over our land and our animals and each other. What would be a more powerful solution would be eating things that will help continue to keep our planet alive. Another documentary on Netflix, The Game Changers, speaks upon the benefits of a plant-based diet, showing viewers that yes, you can still function well without meat. This slide I have listed kind of breaks down our food print. I think everyone's heard of our carbon footprint, and this is just highlighting the fact that the less meat, the less footprint that we're going to have on our planet. While going vegan and completely cutting meat and dairy out of your diet might seem like a really daunting task, it can be a gradual process. I crave meat products and eat them from time to time, but simply cutting back would really help. It's about making an effort and having those little acts add up as a society. I think that watching the documentaries are a quick and fairly easy way to gain more insight on how our food is coming to our table. I personally am trying to be more plant-based, and for me this means focusing on eating mostly plants. I find that I have the same energy levels compared to having meat in my diet, and oftentimes after eating large amounts of meat, I feel sluggish and ready for a nap, and I'm sure most people can relate to that. Whereas I rarely feel that after consuming fruits and vegetables and whole grains. And here's another great chart that puts the land use and the greenhouse gas emissions, comparing cow's milk to soy milk. Huge difference. Beef to peas or nuts. Huge difference. I mean, you really can't deny what's on paper here. Another great picture I found was the amount of land use and the calories produced. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of land use, and we're only producing 18% calories. So it just doesn't really quite add up, as well as the amount of water it's taking. Beef, you can see, is the most, and vegetables are the least. A really great quote I saw was, going plant-based could reduce emissions by 73% and would require 3.1 billion hectares less farmland. So it's a really big percentage, all from just changing our diets. So I think that brings a lot of hope to the table. And another thing that we can think about is supporting our local farmers markets and these families that are producing fresh produce for us all the time. So I think that it's really intimidating to stop eating meat completely, but I really do think it's doable. So educating yourself is the first step, and educating your friends and family, and maybe shopping somewhere different that you haven't normally gone. The farmers markets on Saturdays in Charleston is a great start. So there is hope. So the final note I want to end on is just at least give it a try, maybe a week or two, more plant-based, cutting out a little bit of meat at a time, and just see how you feel. Maybe it's not as bad as we all think it will be.